Do you want to be ahead of the game for the latest in arts, music, cuisine, and entertainment across the Middle East's most dynamic capital cities? Al Monitor is proud to launch our City Pulse newsletters, focused exclusively on local news, starting in Riyadh, Dubai, Istanbul, and Doha. Each week, our on-the-ground writers in these cities cover the latest cultural happenings and trends, so you have everything you need to know for the best local experiences. To subscribe for free, go to almonitor.com, that's al-monitor.com, and sign up on our newsletter page.
Welcome back to the Al Monitor Brief. I'm Adam Lucente. U.S. President Donald Trump's second term began on Monday with a Republican majority in both the House and the Senate. With this trifecta, Republicans in Congress have the opportunity to help shape U.S. policy with regards to support for Israel, sanctions against Iran, and more. But what are Congress's priorities with regards to the Middle East now that Trump is back in office? And how do views among Republicans on Capitol Hill compare to the president's? My guest this week is Al Monitor contributor Megan Mineiro. Megan covers Middle East and foreign policy developments on the Hill and offers insights into the relationship between the legislative body and the president on regional issues. Hope you enjoy. Megan, welcome back to the Al Monitor Brief.
Thanks. It's good to be here.
Yeah, great to have you back with us. My first question is, what are Congress's Middle East priorities expected to be now that President Trump is back in office?
So I think it's most important to keep in mind that the majority of Republicans in both the House and the Senate are going to be closely aligned with Trump. So the majority of members will likely back any Middle East policy coming out of the White House. We could see some Republicans who have the ear of the president playing an advisory role in the development of those policies in sort of an informal way, or in White House meetings where then they go to the sticks after and they discuss what they talked about with the president. That could manifest in the Trump administration's role in helping to implement the ceasefire and hostage deal now in effect in Gaza, or maybe later down the road, a possible normalization deal between Israel and Saudi Arabia. Both the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and the House Foreign Affairs Committee are strong supporters of President Trump. But it will definitely be Trump laying the path and Republicans happily following along. That said, we can look to the early days of the new Congress to understand where Republicans' top priority lies in the Middle East, and that's with Israel. Strong support for Israel is front of mind for Republicans in both chambers, and the first bill to pass the House earlier this month was an immigration bill. The second bill was one that would sanction the International Criminal Court. So Republicans in both chambers make the case that the court is anti-Semitic, operating outside of its intended jurisdiction. They sharply condemn the ICC for issuing arrest warrants for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and former Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant. So that bill did pass the House, and Majority Leader John Thune has promised legislation will soon be on the Senate floor. If they pass it, it'll go to Trump's desk to be signed. So at least a few Senate Democrats will likely support that ICC sanctions bill, while the top Senate Foreign Relations Democrat has said she has serious concerns. I think we can expect at least a handful of pro-Israel Democrats to vote for in the Senate. So once they get that across the finish line, they'll be making good on a promise they made last year to sanction the ICC for its actions against Israel. So they're already on their way with that priority. A second very high priority close behind is defunding UNRWA, the UN agency that assists Palestinian refugees. This move is deeply rooted in a dozen UNRWA employees who reportedly participated in the Hamas attack on Israel on October 7th. But Republicans have for years been talking about defunding UNRWA. How the U.S. would continue to assist Palestinians, especially in Gaza, is sort of still up in the air. Republican Congresswoman Elise Stefanik, who was a lead voice in the House calling for an end to UNRWA funding and is now Trump's nominee to be U.S. ambassador, said yesterday in her Senate confirmation hearing that the UN Human Rights Council, UNHCR, or the UN Food Program could possibly be an alternative partner for USAID, the Agency for International Development, to work with in aiding Palestinians. But Republicans really haven't gotten into any detail on what continued funding for Palestinians would look like. They've just made very clear that they are unhappy with UNRWA and plan to, now that they're in the majority, cut any funding for them moving forward. So that has yet to happen. The final government funding bill for fiscal 2025 is still in its draft form. The deadline to pass that is in March, so we could see that finalized in that bill. There's a handful of other bills related to Israel and Palestinians that Republicans might try to push forward, but those are the two top priorities for sure.
Thank you. Shifting to Iran, how do you think Republicans in Congress might influence or complement the Trump administration's approach to the Islamic Republic?
So once again, Republicans are going to be following Trump's lead, but we do know that senior Republicans in Congress and the president do seem to agree on the need for a maximum pressure campaign against Iran. Trump could always change course, as he's sometimes prone to do, as it relates to Iran. But if they continue to be aligned on that maximum pressure campaign, that would look like additional economic sanctions, a possible freezing over of diplomatic ties. Senate Foreign Relations Chairman Jim Risch also told Al Monitor last month that there could be a boost in military aid for regional partners to help them counter Iran. And it's a top priority for him. This is a little in the weeds, but to better enforce what he says are two sanctions bills that were passed last year and signed into law by President Joe Biden that Risch, the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, argues have not been properly enforced and are thus like giving Iran a little bit of a pass. The first bill is the first sanctions law that was passed, rather, is the Stop Harboring Iranian Petroleum Act, or SHIP Act. That bill targeted foreign ports and vessels that knowingly engage in the transfer of Iranian oil. And the second sanctions law was the Masa Amini Human Rights and Security Accountability Act, or MASA Act. That one was named after the Kurdish Iranian woman who died in 2022 after being held in custody by Iran's morality police. So that bill looks to crack down on Iran with additional sanctions as it relates to human rights violations. So Risch really wants the Trump administration to take what he sees as action that the Biden administration failed to take and really coming down hard on Iran with those two new sanctions laws. Experts tell me that there could also be bipartisan appetite for a new approach on Iran. President Biden had promised to re-enter the 2015 Iran nuclear deal and wasn't able to make that happen by the end of his term. So there could be interest in a new approach, especially given that the perception in Washington on both sides of the aisle is that Iran is vulnerable and isolated. Its proxies are weakened across the region after the fall of Assad, and the strength of Hezbollah and Hamas being greatly diminished by Israel's attacks over the last year or so.
Don't go anywhere. We'll be back with Megan Mineiro after this short break.
Today's transformation of the Middle East is at the center of global geopolitics. Whether you're an analyst, diplomat, executive, or academic, you need the best reporting and analysis to understand what's really happening on the ground and what it means for the world. Al Monitor is the award-winning independent leader in Middle East news. From Riyadh to Beirut, Abu Dhabi to Doha, and Baghdad to Tehran, our team of over 100 expert journalists report daily on the top stories driving the regional trends. Download our mobile app and subscribe to Al Monitor to follow what leaders and decision makers are reading every day. Go to almonitor.com. That's AL-MONITOR.com, and use promo code POD25, POD25 for a discount.
Okay, we're back. Megan, my last question is about Syria. How do views among Republicans in Congress on Syria differ or compare to Trump's recent statements on the situation there?
Yeah, so Trump has signaled he doesn't want to get involved in the power shakedown or shakeout that's happening in Syria right now since the fall of the Assad regime. If I'm remembering correctly, he said in a post right after Assad fell that the U.S. should have nothing to do with it, as these various militant groups kind of vie for control, and we wait to see kind of what the final structure is of the Syrian government in this next phase. We'll continue to watch to see how Trump responds, how realistic it is that he could just have nothing to do with it. We will have to wait and see. The president hasn't said whether he plans to keep the around 2,000 U.S. troops that are in Syria stationed there. In the past, he has spoken strongly about tightening the U.S. military footprint in the Middle East. But I would expect there to be some resistance, probably not publicly, but behind closed doors to any move to withdraw those troops, especially from senior Republicans in foreign policy on the Hill, who I'm sure would warn the president, and I expect his staff would warn him the same, that withdrawing those troops would pose a risk as it relates to the Islamic State, ISIS, reemerging in the region. And Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who just got on the job yesterday, has said it is important to continue supporting Syrian Kurdish forces that the U.S. has worked closely with in Syria to continue to counter ISIS. So we know at least that Rubio would potentially be a voice for keeping U.S. boots on the ground in Syria. But again, how lawmakers respond, I think publicly, they're going to fall in line with pretty much anything the president puts forward. Behind closed doors, it could be a little more nuanced. But I do expect that lawmakers on both sides of the aisle in both chambers are going to continue to push for protections and some degree of U.S. Humanitarian support for Syria. That came up briefly in UN Ambassador nominee Elise Stefanik's hearing yesterday of the Senate about the role that the UN and the U.S. would play in Syria moving forward.
Megan, thanks so much for your time, and we look forward to more of your reporting from Congress.
Yeah, thank you so much for your work on this and for having me on, Adam.
Thanks for listening to the Al Monitor Brief. Follow Al Monitor for more on the stories impacting the Middle East.